Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bryce is Right. My name is Bryce, and I believe in promoting positive atheism and secular humanism. Today, we're going to be having a conversation with a criminologist. His name is Chris Smith, and he is a tutor in criminology with a focus on sex crimes and crimes against children. He also has a bachelor's from the University of La Verne or La Verne. I think I said that right. He'll correct me. It's in San Bernardino, California, and pursuing a master's in child adolescent development. He works for a nonprofit that provides after school instruction for at risk children. So this sounds like a really good guy all around. And I'm interested to get his perspective on religion and theology. We'll also explore criminology, which is his background, and talk about abuse and trauma and why he does what he does. I'll also be asking him about his position on feminism because he identifies himself as a feminist as well. And we'll see whether or not he fits the label of social justice warrior. So without further ado, Chris Smith, welcome to the Bryce is Right. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. So a little about myself. I'm a site captain for a program that provides tutoring and social emotional learning for at-risk kids. I'm gonna go ahead and not say exactly where that's at. Not that you're asking, but
we know the general area.
Yeah, Sunny did the same thing, and I think it was wise. She did that for her own reasons, but that's my academic background, right? I have an associate's in criminal justice, a bachelor's in criminology. My focus was sex crimes and crimes against children. My senior thesis was called Damnation's Gambit, an examination of negligent homicide, abuse, concealment of sexual abuse, and faith healing deaths in Bible Belt areas or areas where religious institutions have pervasive influence. This is, and we'll get into this a little later, but this is my black ledger. This is the ledger in which I have a lot of the autopsy reports and legal documents and depositions and everything else that pertain to those cases. And I'm sure that we'll crack into that, as we go on. But
yeah, absolutely.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
You want to know about me?
Yeah, I do.
Well, I usually start the show by saying that I have an interest in promoting positive atheism and secular humanism, but that's actually a pretty good question because it's been a while since I've kind of described myself to my audience, and some people may be watching me without really knowing what my background is. But since this is the first time we've actually had a face-to-face conversation,
yes,
I am a former theist. I am a deconverted Christian as of about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm a military veteran, and I found myself kind of getting out of my religious beliefs towards the end of my career, which made for an interesting transition. But I kind of don't really know what I'm doing. I'm out here kind of just sharing my thoughts and my beliefs and trying to get acquainted with other people, both in the atheist community, but also just people who are still theists and trying to figure out why they believe what they still do. And but enough about me. I am curious about you. I want to know, and you did a really good job with your introduction. I'm very fascinated by the criminal justice element, which we'll get into. But are you? I gather from your profile that you are an atheist, correct?
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
What were you always an atheist, or?
So I have noticed something. My deconversion, I think it was a little more. I think it was fairly linear. I think also it was a lot less traumatic than the deconversion that most atheists have gone through. I dealt with and I suspect, you don't tell me, but I suspect that you and I are both atheists. Maybe the catalyst for that has to do with the problem of evil.
Actually, you'd be wrong about that. but I do share a lot of beliefs about the problem of evil. And I wouldn't describe it as a catalyst in my case for deconversion, but it was certainly something that made me question, and it was something that made me investigate further and read the Bible more and become more familiar with the religion that I professed. And then I started discovering erroneous things, which is what led to so I guess in a sense it was a catalyst, but it wasn't the thing that made me come out of religion, the moral arguments and the problem of evil. Yeah. For a lot of people, I notice it is, though, and I totally get that. Yes. And I sense that it was that way for you.
Yeah, definitely. So the way that my household was, I had a religious upbringing, and I was a studious note taker at church and everything else. I went to a Baptist church in Beaumont. I lived in Moreno Valley for many years until I was 13. And I had gone to that church. My aunt worked at that church. And my mom was very religious. My mom was from Louisiana. So, she grew up in the South, and with religion's a huge part of your culture and everything else. My dad, on the other hand, had grew up all up and down California and even lived in a few other states. He was a really fiercely independent person. I mean, just independent in a way that we don't let kids be independent anymore. He was much more of an agnostic atheist. So I kind of grew up,
agnostic atheist.
Yeah, and so I kind of grew up having this mom who's very religious, but not horribly strict about it. Had definitely grown up with these old Southern ways and everything else. And my dad, who'd grown up with these very Western ways, and he lived in San Francisco or in the Bay Area for a time, and he had been exposed to all kinds of different spiritualism and types of spiritual beliefs and everything else. So I think it's interesting because I think the some influence of that on him was kind of not a complete rejection, but more like maybe they'll have a piece of the truth, but here's what I think. And what my dad thought at that period of time in my life as a kid was, I think that when you die, it's like shutting off the TV and snipping the cord. I don't think there is anything else. And he'd be like, that's just me. That's just how I think. Your mother thinks differently. Still listen to your mother and consider what she says. And you go to church, you take the notes and everything else. But he'd be like, son, that's my take on it. And he's like, you don't have to believe what I believe and everything else. So I was very lucky to have parents that allowed me, the freedom. When I first started really rejecting religion, I ran up against a lot of opposition from my mom. But in my mom's mind, it was such a positive thing for her.
How long ago would you say that was?
When I was a teenager. So at 13, I witnessed a homicide. And that was the major catalyst for me really beginning to doubt things. But it's interesting because that wasn't completely what did it for me. I tried to hang on to that. And, and as I moved through, I'd put through grief and some other things, and I really wanted to hang on to that, but just found that I really kind of couldn't. What really did it was going to churches and, friends' churches and stuff like that, and talking to the youth pastors and realizing these people who we put enormous trust in, we give them enormous, we give them this enormous scope of influence to mold young minds. And these are people who have no real good answers. The answers were just dissatisfactory. And, at the age of 13, I moved to Paris, and that's when that happened, at Paris, California. And
thank you for that.
Yeah, that way no one thinks it's either Paris, France, or Paris, Texas, right? Yeah. And then at the age of 15, I moved to San Bernadino. And in my 2 years in Paris and my many years in San Bernadino and into present day, I have seen and experienced a lot that puts the issue of evil, to you very starkly. Mm-hmm. And I felt that the people who were least capable of providing satisfactory answers for you that were the religious, and the more religious they were, the least they were able to stomach it, the least they were able to explain it, the least they were able to provide prescriptions for solving that.
And not only that, but I imagine, San Bernardino being infamous for a terrorist incident a few years ago involving religious extremists, so being witness to something like that, probably, I'm sure you were much older then, but this is something that we see with religion, where it can actually be the instigators of violence and death. A lot of people have died in the name of religion, various religions, you know, and that's kind of hard to reconcile with, you know, what most of the adherents of religion proclaim that it's about.
Yes, and you know, I'll tell you something weird. Is I met that guy on multiple occasions. I met the shooter. I was a lifeguard for the city for many years. I was a lifeguard for the city for 4 years, and he was a health inspector who would sometimes come and take the chemical. He would do the chemical readings for the pools, and you know, he was definitely odd. He wore a big straw hat that was very stupid, and that definitely stuck out. And he would kind of linger around and want to talk to our manager a lot. Weird considering he was married, you know, also. But it was this moment where, you know, when they started putting out his mugshot and everything else, I was like, man, why do I feel like I've seen this person before? And then yeah, after, I think I was after a few days, it hit me that that's who it was. And yeah, that was a crazy day. I was tutoring at Chafee College at the time for the multi-academy center, and my stepdaughter, their school, all schools throughout San Bernadino were on lockdown that day. It was a really horrible situation. They went and took his name off of all the little cards that he'd ever done. It was just this weird situation.
Do you remember what year that was?
I want to say it was like 2015, the last few weeks of 2015.
Yeah, I think it was, because I think I used to live in Lancaster, which is not too far from San Bernardino. Yeah. And yeah, that was a pretty terrible situation. But you were tutoring people. You're a tutor of criminology, right?
I'm a criminologist, but right now I'm tutoring children. I tutor children at the elementary school level.
Oh, okay.
And I love that, and it's a huge privilege to be. You know, I know some adults who just can't seem to get kids to like them. That's definitely not a problem for me, and I just feel very privileged that kids like me. You know, some adults, kids just don't like, and there are sometimes really great reasons for that, and there are sometimes just they don't like your face,
right?
You know, they don't like your mannerisms, or you're too grown up for them. You know, they don't feel like they can relate to you or something. But no, I'm very lucky to have the kind of impact that I have.
How did you develop an interest in criminology?
Through my personal experiences, right? I will tell you, I am the sort of person that people have always, for probably at least from when I was a teenager on, and maybe even younger than that, people have always felt comfortable telling me things. When you grow up,
I guess maybe I should start by asking you, what is a criminologist? What does a criminologist do?
A criminologist is somebody who studies crime. Right, and as someone who has had crime impact their life on multiple fronts, I was very interested in the root causes of it. And one of the major catalysts that actually, and it's so sad because he died just this last December. One of the major catalysts to getting me to go to college, which I did not think was for me. Actually, I always saw myself as this working class person. Working class family. All I wanted to do was just work and have a family and everything else. And as we see now, that was quite delusional. Nobody can just work and have a family anymore, almost. But you know, I read the work of this author named Andrew Vox, who's also a lawyer who specializes in representing youth and children exclusively. And I was reading his articles, his interviews, and suddenly all of these life experiences that I had had. It started to lock into place. You know, the explanations for evil that religion prescribes are just completely inadequate. And in many ways, people's understanding of mental illness is very inadequate, right? We tend to have an idea of, you know, horrible things that people do as just so aberrational. Well, you never really know what's going on in somebody's mind. You never really know. Now, maybe it's genes, or maybe there's people who are born bad, and then at their 20th birthday, just the genes activate and they start doing horrible things, or, you know, in the religious prescriptions, right? Well, evil is always lurking in men's hearts. You know, I mean, does it make sense to believe that all men are equally capable of things like, you know, rape and sodomy and child abuse? No, it doesn't. And, you know, candidly, both my parents were very heavily traumatized as children. You know, when they were dysfunctional people in their ways, But when I shut my door and I turned my lock, I knew that I was in a safe house. And that was far more than they got as kids. And it's far more than many people get as kids. And what my experiences, out on the streets, just growing up as a teenager, having friends, being out, and everything else, they put those questions to me front and center. I had friends who'd been trafficked. At the park across the street from my high school, I met prostitutes. They would just hang out there and smoke. And, if you speak to them and you just ask questions, you just, are, especially if you're a naive kid who's like 16, they will tell you what you want to know. Mm-hmm. And they'll tell you a lot because no one ever listens to them. And especially nobody legitimate in society, police and people like that. They will tell you a lot about their backgrounds and their upbringings and what brought them to this point and how they feel about it, whether they feel they're selling themselves out or whether the rest of society does that, but they're the only ones who are honest about it.
Listening to you speak, I have to say that I noticed in the beginning you were trying to draw some parallels between our experiences, but there are some because my studies were in psychology, and I actually I graduated from the University of Antelope Valley, which is near San Bernadino. But the psychology I found intersects with criminology in a lot of ways. One of my instructors, actually, one of my professors, was a retired police officer, Los Angeles County police officer, who had a master's. I think he was going for a doctorate in criminal justice. And so listening to kind of the ways that you talked about the psychology of trauma and abuse and what makes people evil, I find that it intersects with psychology in a lot of ways. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, a lot of criminology, I think, is just applied psychology, applied sociology. And it's funny too because unfortunately, even at the university level, criminology has this sort of crisis of identity, and it should. It cannot just be an institute of stat collecting and stat crunching. That it can't just be this instrument for the state to expand its power, right? That would be criminology at its least useful, most useless, most pernicious, right?
It's kind of a self-licking lollipop there. If it's if you're investing all these resources into studying something that you're never actually going to apply to help victims, right? It's kind of useless.
Yeah, I absolutely, and I think that needs to be the focus. It needs to be a social good, and it needs to be willing to push society to reform and push society to change in the ways that it needs to change.
Well, let's come back to that because I will have some questions that go back into that, but I want to keep on religion for a moment. You talked about your religious background and that you weren't really super religious as a kid, but you found yourself really questioning and kind of deconverting as a teenager. I'm wondering, are you familiar, or I guess I should ask, how familiar are you with the atheist community? Is this something that you are recently discovering or something that you've been into for a while?
So I would say I'm sort of a hermit. I'm sort of reclusive sometimes. So I can't say that I go to the banquets and I make an appearance at all the things, but I've been plugged into the community since 2013. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jen Ramirez or Raft or the IEAA, but I've been to events from both of those groups. And, I've met people like Phil Calderon, who's excellent. Again, so is Jen Ramirez.
He's a close friend of ours.
Phil Calderon is just, man, it's every time.
He's actually one of our associate producers here at TANG, and also on PSF. I have a couple of shows where he's been involved with, so he's a great guy.
Very calming guy. Love seeing him. I've done a talk as well about my senior thesis, and talk about preaching to the choir, right? But they were well received. I've got along definitely with everybody who I've met in the atheist community, which is pretty interesting considering it's like herding cats, and that everybody doesn't have to agree. And that's the great thing, is that everybody's very, no matter what their political persuasions, they're pretty logic based. So,
right.
And tend to have a good sense of boundaries to where if we don't all have to be on the same page about certain things, which makes any kind of debate or discussion very interesting.
Yeah, because if we're on, this is something we actually talked about in our Tang Discord last night. The fact that we're not all like-minded automatons. If atheism is a lack of belief, right? And so it's something that we share in common, but it's not really a worldview beyond that.
Yes, I
Some
agree.
atheists are political, some are apolitical, right? Some are right-wing people, some are left-wing, some are, into they're determinists or naturalists or humanists. There's all kind of ists that you can add to an atheist to make it more of a worldview, but it's all very between us. There's no doctrines or tenets or rules or governing body of atheism. As soon as you start doing that, then it's a religion, right? Which is the thing that atheists claim to be wanting to get away from. So, but I digress. You come from an atheist perspective now. Given what you do for a living, and you talked about working with at-risk children, do you find that there's ever any resistance to your approach from the more religious-minded parents? Have you ever got any criticism from religious people based on your approach, or do you find it to be not really relevant?
So, you know what's interesting is I have a few parents that are religious or spiritual, and I am transparent. One told me, "Well, I don't know if you're a religious man, but it sounds to me like you're doing God's work." And I told him that's a huge compliment. I said, "I'll be totally transparent with you. I'm not." I said, "But thank you." I said,
Mhm.
I said, "So I'm judging that you are." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I am. I didn't mean to offend you." And I'm like, "No, no, no, that's fine. So this is a big compliment coming from you."
I
Uh,
think that it's important, by the way, and I'm only interrupting you because I think that that is a great example to show how there's differences within the atheist community. I know a lot of atheists who might be offended by that. His when he stopped you and said, "I didn't mean to offend you," there is a legitimate possibility that an atheist could be offended by that.
yeah,
And I think without cause, because you're right, it is actually very complimentary, and it's sort of ironic, because if a theist can see God's work in atheism, maybe that says something about the atheist or the secular approach compared to the religious approach. I think it's a great example for them. I don't know how you feel about it.
you know what? I'm a very thick-skinned person. It's gonna take the sort of things that that I actually find offensive or upset me. They're pretty substantive. Um, Slights like that are not something that I find. This isn't a threat to me. In fact, I'll say this is where like a little bit of dash of cultural relativism is a good thing, because really what that person is trying to say actually is a high compliment, and probably the vast majority of people they interact with are religious. And he made the effort to backpedal as well. So I was like, no, 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 I appreciate that. That's fine. And I have another parent who they already know this about me, so they'll say, well, I know you don't believe, and that's fine. But man, I just think that like you're doing a great job, and like God has put people together for a reason, and um, way in the back of my head, there's an objection, but it's way in the back of my head. I don't need to verbalize that in my professional life. Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. People are strange about that. Get very upset about these slights, and then like I don't know, when it comes to things that are much more objective, that I think they could be way more effective in voicing their kind of, then they apply the cultural relativism.
But that is sort of the benefit to being in California, I would say in your case, because there's a lot of people who do kind of similar things to what you do, but they're not in California. They're in much more religious, Sunny Shell, who you
Yeah,
just did a show with recently, over on PSF. She works with us here as well. But she uses a pseudonym because she's in the Bible Belt, and
yeah,
she does work similar to what you do. But in the religious environment that she's in, the people there would not take kindly to the fact that she's an atheist. So just the
yeah.
fact that
I would
I,
handle
I
things differently if I were there too. Yeah,
right, I think that may be the difference between being in California. People think, oh, well, it's super liberal and everybody's an atheist. I don't know if they really think that or not. Obviously, that's not true. There's a lot of religious people in California too, but they don't. It's almost like they don't take it as seriously, or they're not as high strung about it, which kind of gives you the freedom to be an atheist and be open about it, doing what you do, working with people's kids and all that. Is that kind of how you see it as well?
Yeah, I think, I haven't come across, that's the thing, whenever people ask or anything like that, I just tell them. And it's funny because I don't know if it's the way that I look or what, but people are never really surprised.
Right.
I sort of have like a severe face. I have a face that's very serious. It seems very stern. So I don't know if that deters people from making a bigger deal about that than they would, but I've never said that and had a parent be like, oh, and not trust me or not want me influencing. There's nothing that I do that involves spiritualism really. If I'm sitting and I'm connecting with a child, that's not spiritually that I don't need to do that to connect with them.
Right.
What I need to do to connect with them is be a consistent presence in their life, which I work 5 days a week. I need to allow them to have a voice. I need to be willing to hear them out and even tolerate maybe a bit of disrespect if they're particularly agitated or anxious or angry. I need to speak with them in a way that makes them feel heard and seen. None of those things, I think you can do any of those things if you're religious. I think you can do any of those things if you're atheist. But I think that where religion creates an obstacle to doing those things is definitely its authoritarian aspects. I think you have to be able to shed a little bit of that ego-driven sort of, those ego-driven beliefs. I'm an adult. No, you respect me. You don't talk to me that way. I think you have to be willing to set a little bit of that aside, especially if you're going to be dealing with kids who've been traumatized. And the students who I have, you would never guess from their behavior, you would never guess from their kindness, the sort of things that they've been through. You would never put those things together.
Let me take a moment to actually let's pause on that for a moment. Let me take a moment to acknowledge the guys in the chat here who are watching. I always like to give a shout out to anybody who's participating in the conversation. By the way, anybody who's listening to this, if you have any questions for Chris, feel free to throw them in. I'm much more likely to see it and notice it if it's a super chat. Hint, hint, wink, wink. But clearly misunderstood. Welcome. We got Billy Guerrero. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that name before, but awesome. Aunt Kathy. Oh, do you?
Yeah.
We got Aunt Kathy as usual, Aunt Jura, John Christian. We've got Jenna from Tang. A lot of our usual suspects, Bible Burner. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. KCA Randy as well. Awesome. And cool. Theoretically, is there, I see Ian Davenport. Yeah. Like I said, guys, if you guys got questions, feel free to throw them in. This is my first conversation with Mr. Chris Smith, and it's my first time having a criminologist on board. And, I'm curious, going to the trauma that you were talking about a few seconds ago and a lot of the abuse that people that you've seen and dealt with, how impactful is religion, would you say, in any of this? Do you think that people are traumatized by religion in some aspects? Because I know people who say that all the time. I know a lot of atheists who are deconverting say that they've experienced religious trauma, but to what extent would you say that religious indoctrination plays a role on trauma, whether childhood or adulthood?
I think it can play a tremendous role. I spoke about this with Sonny for a bit, and I'll speak about it here. One of the most pernicious moral teachings in religion is that of forgiveness. And when you're talking about crimes against children, I don't think there's any other moral precept that allows so many crimes to go unhindered, to continue. I can't think of anything that is an offender's. I can't think of a better friend to a perpetrator, whether that's of sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect. I can think of a better friend to a perpetrator, and something that better assists the camouflage that they utilize prey on kids. Typically, these are people who do this. That idea of this sort of stranger danger myth, the idea of the guy who hides in the bushes and he takes your kid and everything else. People's ideas of trafficking and how that happens, they're very skewed. They think it's kids who are brought in from another country. They think it's, kids that are kidnapped. And there are times that happens. But overwhelmingly, children are abused by people within their circle of trust. And a majority within that circle of trust are family members. And families love to forgive.
Wow, that is an interesting perspective. I'm glad you explained that in terms of the connection with forgiveness, or the idea of forgiveness, which comes from religion. And I think that when I think of like sexual abuse and religion in the same sense, it's kind of hard to ignore the crimes of the Catholic Church, right? Because that's something that has been perpetuated for years at the highest levels, where they've hid criminal offenders. But it's almost like they dismiss it with they need to be forgiven, but no, like they don't need to be forgiven. They need to be removed and criminally prosecuted for the protection of people. So that's insidious. That's some of the insidious baggage of religion that I talk about.
It is, and it's if in these situations where there's typically in incest cases that involves the more or less the entire family unit against the victim. And you see these cases where they circle the wagons and it's well, we don't want to handle this with police. We're going to handle this internally. You know how that goes. And there's a huge handicap that's placed upon the child, which is not only must you come to terms with what's been done with you, not only is the onus on you to be abused, but then to turn around and forgive that person. And now, and by default, invest in their rehabilitation. Because forgiveness never involves as a prerequisite, well, you have to forgive this person, but they could do it again. The pretense is that they won't, right? But by asking the person to forgive, by pressuring the person to forgive, you are investing them in their rehabilitation. And so many, many, many victims are absolutely crushed when they bow to the pressure to forgive, or maybe that pressure is internal. Internal religious voices are very powerful. They feel like, well, I'm really not a good person if I don't forgive. I can't hang on to this anger forever. And usually what that is not an actual coming to terms with the anger, but rather a rush to dispense of it, because it's frightening scale. And then after that, it comes out that this person has abused again, or possesses child pornography, trades it. And then there's this feeling of you're responsible somehow. It's really a sick thing to ask people to sully their own hands in their own blood in a crime that was committed against them in that way, which is what that is. And I think that there's, I don't think conservative authoritarian religion is solely responsible for this. I think a lot of people who are otherwise well-meaning and liberal do it as well. And it's disgusting. And in fact, it leads back to, and I know that I'm getting visceral here and getting down to the nitty-gritty, but look,
do it.
Many of the greatest things this country has ever done, the greatest changes that have maybe saved any semblance of civilization that we've been trying to strive to create and build and maintain, have been done with lots of information and lots of anger, liberating children from the factories, the women's vote, the vote for people of color. You don't ask for these things. You don't forgive the people involved. You have to separate them from their power. Whether you do that through the most violent, cruel means imaginable, or through legal means over a period of 20, 30 years, regardless, it has to be done. But overwhelmingly, the scope of human history, forces had to be used. And I think that there's just delusion about that at this point in time. You see, so many of our institutions in our civilization are stagnating because we dispense with people. We neglect people. We neglect our young, which is one of the most dangerous things that a species could do, much less a civilization. And we're not only actively digging our own graves, but we allow people, and many of them are religious, but not all of them are, to steal conflict from us, conflict that needs to be had, and defer reform into something different, something that is so, you know, we don't get police reform, we get it's no longer Aunt Jemima syrup, right? Very performative.
That's so funny because I was literally just looking at that. Was at the store the other day and noticed it for the first time that it's now, I can't remember what the new name is, but I noticed the new name of that. And Ben's original rice, which I also picked up. It's not Uncle Ben's anymore, but it was just funny to me that you mentioned that.
So we get fooled with these performative gestures and that steal conflict and try to instill us with this sense of forgiveness and understanding. But people who abuse power, you cannot continue to entertain that.
You said something very interesting to me a few moments ago, where initially you were sort of talking about how conservative, authoritarian, systems and positions are, inherently promote this idea that you have to, because it comes from religion, frankly, but you also said that there are some liberal people on the liberal side of things that get caught up in that as well. And I think there may be some confusion with some of the people on the left or some of the non-religious people where there is an element in psychology of forgiveness being part of getting over trauma, right? Letting it go and being able to move on, right? And so there's this idea that people have wronged you in the past and you have this hatred and, anger built up that just eats away at you. And part of the healing process is forgiveness and letting it go, right? And there is some truth to that, but that doesn't necessarily mean, one, it has to be something that you do on your own. It can't be implied or not implied. It's not the word. It can't be imbued onto you from outside, right? That has to be part of your healing process, the ability to come to terms and to forgive. And also, not everyone deserves forgiveness. It has to do with, like, the idea of forgiving someone is seeing that they actually have genuine remorse, that they're worthy of forgiveness. People can wrong you and regret it and change, and they might be worthy of forgiveness, but people can wrong you and be the same person 25 years later as they were when they abused you, so you don't just get to they don't just get forgiveness because time went by or because the Bible says so. And I think that's maybe where some of the people on the left may be getting confused, this idea that that everyone ought to be forgiven, right? And we have a super chat from Aunt Kathy. Christianity teaches that from birth we are bad people. What influence do you think this indoctrination has, if any, on perpetrators? That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it has a tremendous influence. And I think it has a tremendous influence in cases of abuse because children overwhelmingly, almost no matter what is done to them, internalize the blame. They really believe all things I've heard. You know what? I was actually dressed a certain way that I'm not usually dressed. And that's what caused him to suffer. That's what caused him to do these things to me. And I always thought that it was my fault. Well, you know what? No, my parents shouldn't have beat me with a belt until I was blistered and smacked me across the face until my lips were swollen. But I was being a bad kid that day. That was how they thought. They needed to sort me out. Or being told every day, you're wicked, you're sinful, you carry the sins of your father, things like that. I had a friend who was the victim of rape and incest at the hands of her father and grandfather for many years, and became very promiscuous at a very young age. I'm talking like 7, 8, 9, just acting like love. And you're talking about a little girl who believes that this is love that has been hammered into her brain. Her experiences encapsulated. She didn't know anything else. Her father was a fanatical Catholic. When he would catch her with these neighborhood boys who put cigarettes out on her back, and eventually had formed the pattern of a cross. Literally, the scars that she carries on her back, pattern of the cross, these ideas of penance and sinfulness and everything else. He's the one who made her this way. He's the one who did this to her. I think that that's one of the most dangerous things, actually. That idea keeps children silent because children are not self-actualized to the point where they can say, you know what, yeah, I was being bad, but you had no right to put your hands on me like that.
Mhm.
Or yeah, okay, I'm dressed how I'm dressed, but you know what? That's totally out of line. You can't do that to me. No, we don't empower children that way. We let children believe, and this is true in a lot of situations, not just religion. I think it's definitely true in the zero tolerance era of schools and police in schools, is that the harm being done to you is being done for your own good. It's better it's better we beat you now than take you from the police later.
Spare the rod, spoil the child, right?
Absolutely. And I think that the internalization starts with, convincing children who are just kids, and kids can be a lot of things. Kids can be great. Kids can also be very chaotic. They can love structure. They can break it up. They can be violent and cruel and pernicious and have anger that enters one area, goes out another. Kids can do a lot of things, but what they are is a work in progress. And people who don't understand that, pour this authoritarianism into them, thinking that they're literally going to put the fear of God into these kids. But fear is not something that has predictable results. I've never been impressed with deterrent results, other than the specific deterrence, the general deterrence. That's like religion's one of the greatest failed general deterrents of all time.
Well, it's designed. It's a method of control. Religion is for controlling people.
Yeah,
And the expression you just used, putting the fear of God into them. The reason that's a common expression, and that's totally biblical, by the way. The Bible says your fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? This idea of putting the fear of God into somebody, that's about control. If these were moral teachings and teaching people to be upstanding people and who value life and who are need to be to interact with their fellow man in positive ways, you wouldn't want to do that through fear, because fear is not the way to do that. I mean, I almost want to quote Star Wars. Fear leads to anger leads to hate leads to the dark side, right? So sorry, that was a terrible Yoda impersonation, but the point is you don't want to be indoctrinating through fear, and that is to me what religion does, and it's about controlling people. But we talked about religion for a moment. I do want to get a little bit into I watched your discussion with Sunny Shell over on the Crucible. I don't know if that was your first time appearing on PSF, but it was a very interesting discussion. Actually, the link for that will be below in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. I highly recommend it. But you guys talked about a lot of things on that show, and one of the things you mentioned was the prison industrial complex. And I was wondering if you could describe what that is and what are the harms associated with that.
That's a huge question. It is an industry that is part of what's called the carceral state, right? The relation this state has with the criminal justice system and the private entities that we've tasked with administrating much of it, right? So in the state of California, our education spending has gone down and down and down proportionally. The amount of colleges that we're building every year has gone down and down and down proportionally. The amount of prisons that we built and the amount that we've spent on corrections has gone up and up and up. And it would be one thing if, but we know this is not the case, it would be one thing if we were getting results out of that, if we were actually substantively safer, right? But we're not. And prison as a for-profit enterprise is one of the most perverse incentives that have ever been, one of the most perverse incentives imaginable.
I was about to say it's about making money, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm telling you and what I'm telling your audience, I don't think is anything that you guys don't know. It's California as a state. I said this to Sonny as well. If you're an educator, you know that really your mortal enemy is the prison industrial complex in the state of California. Because it's no longer simply, how do I put this? I'll put it like this. These are companies that have no loyalty to the United States whatsoever. Their loyalty is to their profit margins. They're looking at things in a matter of zeros. They're looking at things in the term of investments, of costs and benefits. It benefits them to undercut education funding. Stupid people benefit them. People who have been deprived of life chances, people whose pathways to legitimate, whose access to pathways of legitimate success are narrow. That benefits them. Their interest is not in fighting crime. And we can talk about fighting crime and fighting criminals, and those are actually two different things. But their interest is in growing their profits. Now, for them to grow their profits, they have to keep people stupid. They have to keep people out of work. There has to be economic scarcity. There's tremendous economic scarcity in the state of California. This is a great place to make money. It's not a great, that money does not go as farther as other states. It's not a great place to buy a house. It's not.
I'm wondering, Chris.
Yeah.
You just talked about before you told us what the prison industrial complex was, and thank you for that. You sort of mentioned that you didn't think that this was like kind of a big secret and was probably well known to the audience. I think that might be true of this particular audience, but not true of everyone watching the show. And I don't know if that's something that everyone outside of an audience like mine would know. And this is going to lead into my next question. I'm wondering, do you think Americans, the average American, is aware of this situation? Do you think they care about it? And do you think that we focus more on punishment over rehabilitation?
You know, it's funny you say that, because it's almost like it almost feels like T-ball, you know, with that question, because, but it is more complex than it seems. It depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about drugs, we're one of the most punitive countries in the world that doesn't put people to death for drugs and trafficking and related crimes. If we're talking about things like 3 strikes, which we used to have in the state of California, and we had to undo because it had all of these unintended consequences attached to it that made it totally untenable. Many of which professionals in the field, including police officers, told you was going to happen from the get-go. Judges, prosecutors, so on and so forth. So if you're talking about those things, sure. I think people have a perception that the success of the system is so inevitable. There's this sort of culture of, true crime culture and everything else, that the evidence is always there and they're going to catch you eventually, and they always get their person, and we're living in this age of much greater accountability and everything else. But the fact of the matter is that, like in San Bernadino, for instance, they don't solve even a majority of their homicides. And they conflate 2 statistics, actually, which is warrants issued and arrests made. Those are 2 very different things. So, I think that's pretty obvious that doesn't even equal clearance. Mm-hmm. Never mind the fact that, like, you could take a look at their statistics for exceptional clearances, which is a widely used method of basically clearing out cases that the state has no interest in solving.
I think that's true of sex crimes as well, and rape kits that go untested and all of that, right?
Absolutely. And so where I'm going with that is, do we focus more on punishment over rehabilitation when it comes to people who commit these types of crimes against children or women? No. We're actually not anywhere near as punitive. And we have this kind of schizophrenic approach to the issue where we've been extremely punitive. You got to think about 3 strikes, right? Think about water and the path of least resistance, right? There's a lot of things that are felonies out there that aren't things that people can't come back from psychologically, or they can't get their life back on track theoretically, right? Mm-hmm. There are lots of things that don't involve brutal violence towards people that are also very destructive, but are crimes against property. Now, I'm not dismissing those crimes, but I'm saying that those things were felonies. And for many decades in the state of California, we were like, anyone with 3 felonies, that's it. Anyone with 3 felonies, right? Well, that had consequences. And the consequences is that we socked the carceral system full of low-hanging fruit. And in the meantime, it was, we've actually over-incarcerated. And now Chino State Penitentiary is on fire because there's a riot over the conditions. And now guards are catching tuberculosis and bringing it home to their families. And tuberculosis rates are horrible because we pack people in too tightly, and we can't, regulate the level of sanitation that should be there, and everything else. It had all these unintended consequences, and the toss up to all of that, the people who commit crimes that are the most pernicious to society are treated with kid gloves. Yeah, it's horrible.
And I actually want to follow up on that just to navigate it back to the direction that I'm going in. You talked about how drug crimes are, prosecuted at a much greater rate, much harsher, the number of criminal drug offenders, I think, in our prisons outnumbers every other demographic. A lot of them are people of color, Black men, are overrepresented in prisons, and I'm sure you're aware of that with your background. I'm actually wondering, does part of criminal justice learning, so to speak, include critical race theory? And have you ever actually studied that as part of your pursuing criminology, I should just say?
Yeah, actually, and it's interesting because a lot of what we were talking about, I had a really great mentor, professor at Chapey College when I was an undergrad, who he was a Black man. He'd been in the LA Sheriff's Department for 20 years, and his last two were working internal affairs. This guy was just an incredibly straight shooter about everything, and he talked about his experiences. He talked about how different it is to be a Black officer than a white officer, and a lot of what he taught and went over in his classes was critical race theory, but nobody knew to really call it that.
Right.
He never sat down and said, "This is critical race theory." We simply could look at statistics and qualitatively different cases, how they were handled in certain jurisdictions, and just see what's plain to see. When you have, we talked about in his juvenile procedures class, we talked about the school to prison pipeline, and people were just like, he was making heads turn, but he didn't pull any punches about any of that when it came to telling the truth. And simply looking at the fact that in, you would have like comparable cases, and the white student would get suspension and the Black student would get hauled away in cuffs, and then the parent who could not take off from work to pick them up by 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. or whatever the cutoff time was, that kid went to juvie. You could just look at certain things like this and know that. And then when I got to the university level, we went over some of it as well. But I have to say too, there'd be students who tune out. There'd be students who were just like, yeah, okay, so some racists are in the system, when it really gets much deeper than that. And it's funny because I don't know how you can study criminology or the criminal justice system and not come away with that very clear impression.
Yeah, it's not that there's racists in the system. I mean, there are racists in the system, but that's not what critical race theory is saying. What it's saying is that the system is racist. And I think people get twisted up on that because they think saying that the system is racist implies that you're just talking about racists in the system. But what you're actually talking about are the ways in which the system is designed or implemented such that it necessarily harms Black people and other people of color, just based on how it's designed. This from sentencing to pretty much at every level, from arrests, even the way that the laws are written, right? We talk about, you spend a lot of time talking about California, but I know just nationwide, and you tend to see it a lot in the South as well, with the different crime bills that have gone into place and making it so that certain drugs that are more prevalent in certain communities get more time, and that certain policing is done more heavy-handed in certain areas to necessarily result in more arrests of people of a certain background, and then them getting harsher sentences and all of that. Like, that's part of the system,
Yeah.
That's not just like a couple of bad apples here and there. That's the way that we had, I'm from New York originally.
Okay.
And there was a law called stop and frisk a number of years ago that I'm sure you've probably heard of that, but
My professor had me look into it, and he presented everything that I found, including the NYPD commission report that they didn't want to release. The ACLU had to sue them to release it back in 2014. And he showed all these findings to his classes and made them reckon with them. He's like, you people want to be cops and prosecutors. You people want to be pre-law and social workers and everything else. You need to be aware of this and the consequences of this. And so you already know that the vast majority of stops that they made, where they were pulling over these people who were Puerto Rican, who were Black, who were Hispanic, they didn't produce any actionable contraband, any outstanding parking tickets, warrants, anything like that. Yeah, what they really did is horribly inconvenience and disenfranchise minority groups.
Right.
To
but
the
that
effect
was that was the law, like that was their policy, which means that it's a broken system. Let me switch gears just for a moment, because we are getting down to the wire. I do want to talk about feminism, because I noticed on your social media you describe yourself as a feminist. So I also describe myself as a feminist, but I noticed people use that label in different ways. So what is feminism to you?
Feminism is a fight for equality of the sexes and everything else. But I am not someone who learned about feminism primarily through academia, so I am not much of a theorist. I'm somebody who learned about feminism through punk rock was one way, right? But another way was speaking to those prostitutes as a teenager, seeing the way, hearing the way. That women are so severely disenfranchised, and the way that women are treated when they're not functioning in very strict rules. When they start to step outside of those rules, the consequences are pretty severe. And those are the stories.
And you're talking about gender roles that are imposed on them by society, right?
Yeah, and you're talking about women who would just tell you like, well, yeah, most of my clients are married. Most of my clients are fathers, seeing how the real pipeline is not someone who decides I could go to UC Davis or I could be out on the streets of Baseline as a prostitute. It's I was molested in home, or I fled in an abusive home that was neglectful and an unsafe place, and I was quickly recruited by predatory pimps who gave me a job and peddled me in a trade and everything else. And often in their minds, we're all selling our bodies for labor, but they're the ones who are the most marginalized for it. So really, there is not much between them and someone who suffers repetitive motion injuries from working in a warehouse, except people's morality.
Let me not really push back, but I want to offer another thought and kind of get your perspective, because I understand the problem that you're talking about with respect to prostitution, and especially with trafficking, that I think we can all agree is one of the great horrific crimes that continues to be a problem, not just in the United States, but worldwide. But I'm a little bit hesitant to condemn sex work as an industry, because I know that while sex trafficking and forced prostitution is horrible, I do know people who have gone into that, women and men, but people who do that of their own volition and are very comfortable with it. And it's sort of this idea that we're not all the same and we shouldn't all be called victims, and there's nothing degrading or demoralizing about being a sex worker, and it shouldn't be stigmatized that way. All of us are not the same. What do you say? Is that a position that you align with or that you disagree with?
I don't think that that's necessarily so objectionable. I think it comes down to a matter of degrees of people's options and people's economic freedom, and it's not. It's an extremely complex topic. It really is. When I'm talking to women who said, "Oh, I've been doing this since I was 13," that wasn't much of a choice.
That's bad, probably. I imagine most of those are.
But I think you and I agree that's not much of a choice. Yeah.
Right.
And when you have people who are like, "Well, I was 26 and I graduated with a lot of debt, and I
opened an OnlyFans,
became a cam girl or something like that, and then it became these other things." Very different story. Yeah, people have different stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I only mention that because sometimes people who come from a more religious or conservative background will point to, aha, therefore sex is wrong. All sex outside of marriage is wrong and evil and sinful. And that's the evidence. Well, no, because you get people who are adults, self-sufficient, and decide to do an OnlyFans to make money because they're proud of their body, and there's nothing immoral about that at all because they're not being abused in that case, and they're kind of, that's their own thing. And I
Yeah,
guess I just wanted to point
and
out the
yeah,
difference.
no, there are people who do that, and there are people who also do that because they feel, the economic pressure of a rising cost of living and
Right.
stagnated wages, that with decades worth of stagnated wages. Yeah, it is pretty complicated, and the people who I spoke to in my life and my experiences were severely abused people. I think what I do object to, which you haven't said, but what I do object to is the idea of glamorizing a lifestyle like that. I think just a quick tour. Yeah, this is the horrible thing is that we could take a tour like
Hmm.
tonight if we're out here, like tonight through San Bernadino, and you could still see, you know, uh, prostituted minors. You could still see teenage girls, pimped out, and this brings me, to another aspect of where I think 2020 was such a revolt. Is we're still living in conditions like this, but we've given law enforcement far more leeway. We've shredded the Constitution in far more places. We've relaxed so many of the restrictions on how they operate, and they have far more technological gadgetry and resources and everything else than they ever have. But they still can't solve the majority of their homicides. They still can't put child sex offenders away. They still can't crack down on child pornography. They still can't crack down on human trafficking. And when you look at, and the really disturbing thing to me, and this is where I admittedly will start to sound a little conspiratorial, is, well, do they want to solve that problem? Or is somebody on the take? Because like many things that are prohibited, and make no mistake, the suffering and torture of children is very much a prohibited and very sought after market. It
You
has
know,
engrafted to survive. It's engrafted itself into the mechanisms of the state.
I titled this episode "Social Justice Warrior," and I wanted to talk about that label with you because I know that it is often used as a pejorative, particularly by people on the right. But I kind of want to get your thoughts on that. Do you consider yourself a social justice warrior, or is there a problem with that label, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would never go around and call myself a social justice warrior because it sounds very silly. I never call myself a warrior of any kind. I just feel like that's my brother's a combat veteran. He's the warrior, if anything. Um, I don't care what people call me. I
Mhm.
really don't. Um, this is the type of stuff that I care about. This is a list of like all those kids who are dead in Peaceful Valley, Idaho, cemetery because of faith healing. You want to call me a social justice warrior because I campaign about that, so be it. But it doesn't change the fact that those little bodies are buried in that graveyard in mass, side by side by side, going back many generations because of the role that religion has, unchallenged, the privilege that it's carved out in our society and in our legal system, like an abscess, to do this to children and get away with it. So, I mean, yeah, if anybody labeled me a social justice warrior for that, I don't care.
We
Not to sound cranky, but there it is.
I certainly appreciate what you do, and I actually don't have a problem. I think it's stupid using that as a pejorative. So, but yeah, if you don't want to label yourself, that's fine. I think if other people label you that, it's fine because there's nothing wrong with fighting for social justice. We did
Yeah,
have
I think there's been a great poisoning of the well, is what's going on, because they're frightened that the country's really going to change. I think they're more scared of that after 2020 than ever.
Yeah, we do have a question from the chat from Billy. And I guess it's a question to both of us. When atheists are accused of sexual assault and harassment, do you think atheists handle it better than religious folks?
So I think that generally the answer is yes. I'll tell you in this big black ledger, we'll talk about the Watchtower. So the Watchtower Bible and Tract Corporation, which is the corporate, basic, basically the corporate umbrella of what the Watchtower is. So that all the Jehovah's Witnesses stuff is published under this corporation, right?
Mhm.
Which is considered a religious institution. Um, the way that they handle allegations of sexual assault is they use a biblical standard of proof, right? So at any accusation, they consider biblically that if two or more people say something happened, then it happened, right? So they consider, and unfortunately, we still have a legal system that does heavily privilege things like eyewitness testimony. That's kind of a holdover, right? That's something that really needs to be reevaluated, because eyewitness testimony could be horribly misleading. But regardless, what they do is they have a panel of elders review the allegation of abuse, right? So they send the child in with the person who has abused them. And they ask the child, were you abused? And they said, what are your allegations? They say, well, this is what he did to me. And they say to the perpetrator, what do you say to this? How do you respond to this? And they say, oh, no, it didn't happen. Well, as far as they're concerned,
case closed.
Or somebody else is coming over and saying, I saw them do this, case closed. And then bizarrely, and this is where we get into the doctrine of forgiveness as well, if the person says, yes, I did abuse them, you know what, I stumbled, they were dressed a certain way, or I have these dark proclivities that I just can't help, and I'm so stained with sin, oh, my father did these things to me, or whatever. They consider that such a great lead-in for a sermon. It's like they make that person their project and not the victim. And there have been many people who've been disfellowshipped, and I talk about it in all of this, and in some of the court documents. It's horrible. There was a person who was disfellowshipped after his father had molested him for years because he turned out he was gay. They disfellowshipped him. They refellowshipped the father years after that had happened. And
the abuser,
the son that they disfellowshipped, committed suicide. So yeah, I mean, do I think that generally we handle these things better? Yeah. Do I think that we could handle them even better? Yes. I think there's room for improvement. Yeah.
Yeah, and my
point is definitely, there are alternative ways in the criminal justice system to get results.
Yeah, and my answer to that,
but yeah,
my answer to that question, Billy, is yes. Yes, generally speaking, because people who are atheists are not hindered by some of the religious baggage that comes along with, abuse. For one thing, sexual harassment, sexual assault, religion can be used to justify anything, and religion hides a lot of things. Like we talked about the Catholic Church. He talked a little bit about Jehovah's Witnesses. This doesn't mean that every religious person is hindered by their religious faith, but we don't have those hindrances as atheists to punish the people who deserve to be punished. So I would say, generally speaking, my answer to that is yes, but it's not always a given. And I do have one final question for you before I take us out, because I told you we normally go to an hour. I like to go to an hour 15 sometimes, but not too much longer than that. Did you watch the Oscars?
No. Look, yeah.
Now you may not have watched the Oscars, and I didn't watch the Oscars either. Full transparency, neither did I. But we all know what happened, right?
Yeah.
So
my take. I believe. So there was a question of whether or not this was his personal belief. The use of violence was a personal belief of his, or whether it was culturally influenced. I think the whole thing was a big cultural script. Violence has scripts. Violence follows scripts, and one script is the educational ass beating. And another script is the educational form of violence, and that's what that was. He went.
That was actually my next question.
He went. He planted his feet. He made the slap, and he turned around and walked away before Chris Rock could even do anything. Chris Rock took it in stride. It was like watching two people who you have some affinity for. I have affinity for both of those people in many ways, and in some not in some other ways. And it was just like, it's unfortunate, and it was understandable without condemning or condoning. Like, I can understand why that happened. Also, then he went on a weird thing about, I'm trying to be what God's called me to be, like all this other shit. So, the Academy, Woody Allen, Harvey Weinstein, Roman Polanski.
Yeah.
Saunter back to your shrines for these fucking degenerates and get out of my face with this trying to do anything about Will Smith. Chris Rock said he didn't want to press charges. In all actuality, that's probably the best choice. There are people who are like, I'd sue him. I'd call 911 and everything else. You know what? you've got to be kidding me. You people enshrine these people who have
that's interesting.
defiled people. Yeah, I mean, they're the last people to make any kind of judgment call about this.
I totally agree with that. It was, you went a little bit of a different direction.
Another black man, and it happened in front of all of you. Like, you guys would give Roman Polanski another award if you could, despite plying a little girl with champagne and sodomizing her. Fuck you all. Yeah.
My issue with what I saw, and I think I've already made several posts about this, but here my take on it is, first of all, I'll talk about the joke first, because there was a question of whether Chris Rock was sexist and this, that, and the other. He made a joke about G.I. Jane directed towards Jada Pinkett. I think that comedy, he's an edgy comedian, and was it an appropriate joke? I think it was inappropriate. I don't think he knew that she had alopecia. I didn't know that. I don't think a lot of people
question about that.
I don't think a lot of people knew that. I don't know that he would have even told that joke if he knew that. But at the end of the day, the use of violence to address a joke, whether you see it as offensive or not, is totally unacceptable. And
I'm generally against that.
Yeah, and I think that Will Smith behaved terribly. I am very grateful. You mentioned Chris Rock and how he, took the slap. I was very relieved and thankful that he did not react the way that Will Smith had reacted, that he didn't, can you imagine the two of them rolling around in some sort of brawl? Like, I mean, for me, I don't know how you feel about it, but for me, that would have set black men back 100 years for that to be the case on international TV, and so the restraint that Chris Rock had, and I looked for a second like he might have went back to, like, he was going to continue roasting them, but then he stopped himself and he just went on very professionally. I was extremely disappointed with Will Smith's acceptance speech, and the fact that he compared himself to Richard Williams, and he did what you said. He said that he was doing God's work. I imagine by defending women, but then he contradicted himself and implied that the devil made him do it. He said, Denzel Washington said the devil comes for you, and then he starts crying.
Yeah, I love Denzel Washington, and then when you hear him say anything religious, it's like so batshit crazy. He said, what did he say? Something to him like, you got to watch out when you're most successful, because that's when the devil comes for you. And it's like,
right. But the problem problem with that logic is you can't say I'm doing God's work and I'm defending women and then say the devil made me do it. That's two different opposite things. Did God make you do it? Did the devil make you do it? And I think he was just on a religious rant at that point and trying to use religion as an excuse for doing violence. And so he was just all around terrible. And by the way, I'm also a fan of Will Smith. I grew up with Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I love his movies. I will say he did apologize after the fact, but I think that there is something going on there with him. I think there's some deeper issues there that need to be worked out, and hopefully they work it out. Hopefully, Hollywood, and you're right about Hollywood, by the way. I didn't mean to gloss over that point. Hollywood is totally corrupt, and they gave him a standing ovation though. Will Smith, the guy who had literally assaulted the host of the show and didn't walk out in handcuffs. They gave him an award and a standing ovation after that totally unhinged acceptance speech. It's Have you ever seen the movie Billy Madison with Adam Sandler? You know the speech that the host of the competition says afterwards. What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things. That was Will Smith. To me.
Yeah, it was like, it all happened so fast. I don't even know if I think somebody said, I don't think he had time to come back to Earth or something like that.
Yeah.
I didn't even watch the speech. I do see a comment here that says, sounds like toxic masculinity to me.
Yeah.
I didn't. To a certain degree. Yeah. And I think also Will Smith has spent he spent the last few years trying to be like vulnerable and transparent and just being the butt of every joke relentlessly, as unfortunately many men are when they're transparent and when they're vulnerable. And I think this was just, it was like he snapped on the wrong person. I think that there was some beef too, just like some other context, like when they boycotted the Oscars, they brought Chris Rock on to smooth things over. The Oscars, I mean, for their image, and he made a joke at Jada Pinkett Smith's expense, and a joke involving Rihanna's panties and stuff. Very silly. Very, very, just low hanging fruit, crappy joke. But, I think so. I think it went back a little bit longer. I don't think it was just about one joke, but even regardless, yeah.
Yeah, and this comment is just what I just said a few moments ago. It could have turned really ugly, and I guess maybe the one thing that came out of it is the fact that for a while I saw a lot of people defending Will Smith, and it was almost like they thought he was legit to stand up for his woman, and I think that's a totally dumb position, and hopefully there's more people who recognize that violence is not a solution to being called the name at this point. But it didn't seem to be divided.
I generally don't agree with violence over words that aren't threats or really nasty.
The sentiments, they didn't seem to be divided along racial lines. They didn't seem to be divided along political lines or religious. I saw people on every side in every demographic either condemning Will Smith or defending him. So that's the good that came out of it. I hate to imagine what it would have been like if it was not Chris Rock, but a white comedian, and then Will Smith.
I will tell you I think my favorite memes or statements about it that have come out are the ones that say, "Oh yeah, I'll tell you my take on the Will Smith thing. My take is that it's recently come out that Clarence Thomas's wife tried to lobby to overturn the election." You know what I mean? Like people who are pretending to kind of put their Will Smith takes out there and then just throwing in some, rather doom-filled fact about our crumbling republic, and this is all bread and circuses.
Yeah. I'm glad for the people who have their priorities right. I only had to ask about that because it was pseudo related to the concept of violence, and somebody already said toxic masculinity in the comments, and so I think if you're a feminist, some feminists might say that it was okay for Will Smith to defend the honor of his wife. I think that is a non-feminist position. I think that the feminist position is that women don't need men to defend their honor, and the whole concept of defending honor is inherently sexist, misogyny, comes from religion, and we don't need that, right? So that's really the only reason I asked you about that. But yeah, by the way, there's a war in Ukraine right now. The gas prices are pretty high. There's proxy wars in Africa. North Korea just launched an ICBM, and there's real shit going on, right? So thank you for indulging me with that. Thank you for coming on my show and making an appearance. I love getting the perspective of a criminologist.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can have you back. And
I'd be down. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a good experience, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. And we have links to your social media in the description as well for anyone who's interested in Christopher Smith. He is on Facebook and Instagram, and his links are below. So also the link to the PSF show that you were on with Sunny, where you talk a little bit more about the criminal justice aspect, is in the link to the description below. So thank you guys. Thanks to everybody in the chat as well who participated.
Thank you all.
Yeah. And by the way, we didn't discuss this before the show, but we do have a Discord chat that is the link for that will be in the description as well. If you are willing to participate in that, you're invited to. You don't have to. It's just kind of I don't know what your timeline is, but you will be invited to our TANG Discord chat as a person who was a guest on the show.
Thank you.
So, and that is for anyone who's in the chat right now, if you would like to be a part of that discussion, there's the link right there. Don't forget, guys, to like and subscribe to the Atheist Network group for more awesome secular content. And for producer Oz, producer Wes, and Sunny Shell, my name is Bryce Aroni. Have a good morning, have a good afternoon, and have a good night. I will see you guys next time on The Bryce is Right. Take care.